Welcome to the Lost Debate, show for political eclectics. I'm Ravi Gupta, and I'm excited to welcome back our friend from Tangle News, Isaac Saul. If you have not yet, get out there and subscribe and check out their wonderful podcast and YouTube channel. Isaac, we are a few days away from the election. How are you feeling?
Tired already somehow. I don't know. Is that an appropriate answer? Yeah, it's crazy. So much information out there. Everybody's trying to read the tea leaves. There's the fire hose of election fraud claims already starting up. So I'm busy, feel underwater, but also excited and energized, ready to be on the other side of this and get back to some normal work at some point soon, I hope.
You predicted a Trump win. Is that still your prediction today?
I'm still predicting a Trump win. I'd say I hedged that prediction initially by saying that I think this race is basically a coin flip. And I feel less confident that Trump is going to win today than I did 2 weeks ago. I think there are some encouraging signs for Harris in the final days of the election, but I am sticking to that prediction today for now.
Yeah, I told myself I would make a prediction on Monday because I want to give myself the full information. Which is cheating because the voting has already happened while I'm talking, and I don't care. I don't feel like the audience comes to me for that. But the one thing I did do to show my cards is yesterday I purchased Harris on one of the I used Robinhood, but like on one of the prediction markets because she was selling at 37 cents. And that wasn't me saying I think she's going to win. It just is that I think she has a greater than 37% chance of winning. And I largely based that on like, you kind of roll up all the projections. They all seem to be like, they all seem to agree that it's either a straight up coin flip or slightly favored Trump, but not a, 63-37, which is what the prediction markets were showing then. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I also think all we've been hearing for the last couple of weeks is how big the Republican early vote turnout has been, which I think is both misleading and also is driving a lot of people who are playing in the prediction market in a direction that I don't think is particularly wise. And now that we're actually parsing a lot of the early vote data, there are some really, really good signs for Democrats. I mean, I am going to write about this a little bit tomorrow in our last big edition before the election, and talked about a little bit on Twitter. But Politico did this huge analysis of the early vote in Pennsylvania, and they found that a third of the voters who are new voters that didn't cast ballots in the 2020 election are Democratic women, which is massive. I mean, if there is a big gender gap in the enthusiasm and turnout for this race toward women, then Harris is going to win, and she might win running away. And I think conservatives know this. I mean, Charlie Kirk was tweeting yesterday, the pinned tweet on his profile right now on X is that men need to get off the couch and go out and vote. And if they don't, they'll be, listening to Kamala Harris cackle for the next 4 years. And he's serious. I mean, and he's not just a pundit, he's an organizer, and I think is probably pretty close to the campaign. And they know that if there's a massive gender gap in enthusiasm, they're going to lose. And I think some of the early voting data indicates that that might be materializing. So that's maybe the biggest thing that's giving me pause in my whole Trump's going to win the race prediction.
So just so I understand the stat that you mentioned, so you're saying of all the people who have voted in this election who did not in 2020, 1/3 of those are Democratic leaning women.
Yeah, correct. That's according to a Politico analysis of the early vote that's specific to Pennsylvania.
Oh, okay.
But, which is obviously, and many people believe the key to the race, but the top line there to me is just that, the get out the vote campaigns that both Trump and Harris are running are basically going to be the difference. This is a tied election statistically by basically every measure. I mean, all the polls are within the margin of error. And so it's going to be who can motivate voters and get them out. And if we're seeing that kind of discrepancy in an early vote that's supposed to be favorable for Republicans, I think that's like a pretty big sign that maybe Democrats are doing better than people think. election day could change all of this. Early vote's incredibly hard to read, but if I were Democrats, that's a positive sign I'd be holding on to.
Well, one piece of news that just came out this morning that I think is relevant to the point you're making is this Gallup poll around voter enthusiasm. And what they showed here is that in comparing to previous election cycles, Democrats have never been more enthusiastic. And this is going back to 2000. So every election that you and I have been able to vote on as adults, this is the most enthusiastic Democratic electorate we've ever seen. Interestingly, the Republican enthusiasm is about what it was in 2020. So about 1 point higher. And I don't know how this is possible, but the highest enthusiasm for Republicans was in 2012, according to this analysis, which really, that wouldn't have been my guess. The lowest was 2016 for everybody, which is fascinating. I mean, 2000 was low too, but that was the Coke Pepsi election, as they say, where they said there was no difference between the candidates, which, we could spend a whole hour on, but we will not. But this looks like good news for Democrats, and it's in line with obviously you don't get extra credit for pulling the lever with more enthusiasm, but if you do believe that there is a real turnout question in this election, the enthusiastic ones are more likely to show up. It dovetails with the data you just talked about, and it's in line with something Nate Cohn wrote yesterday, which is that if you look at prior voting histories, the people who turned out in previous elections, and let me pull this up so I have this right. So voters who voted in primaries in 22 and 2024 is +3 Harris. Voted in 2022, but not in the primaries, even. 2020 general election only, +12 Trump. No voting history, +19 Trump. So the question that we have in front of us, there's two. One is like, is this good news or bad news for either campaign? With that data, I don't think it either tells you one way or another. If you think it's going to be a low turnout election, that's probably good news for Harris. But what I think it tells you is what each campaign needs to do here. And I think for Trump, he needs to turn out his base, which Isaac perhaps explains some of his behavior over the past few weeks.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the low propensity voters are the key for him. It's people, like you said, who only voted in 2020 or don't typically vote in these kinds of elections. And yes, it's the people who, might be motivated by, shock jock humor at a rally at Madison Square Garden, or Elon Musk telling people that they're going to push them, to come out. I mean, there's a lot going on here. I'll say I have two theories related to the kind of voter enthusiasm and how we're reading it. The first one is that I think you can make a case now that the kind of bubble we're living in is actually a sort of conservative red bubble now. In 2016, Trump winning was kind of a shock to the whole system. And all we did was talk about how progressives and the media and the Democratic establishment was just living in this bubble, that we were, totally divorced. We being the media, were totally divorced from the reality that was happening on the ground. But in the 8 years since, everything has just revolved around Trump. I mean, he sets the terms for a lot of the debates that are happening. And now the information bubble, as it exists in places like Twitter or X, where we have really good data now and good reporting on the fact that this platform is very, construed towards promoting pro-Trump material. All the conversations and debates that are happening are kind of starting there. The bubble to me is like telling us that there's this really big Trump enthusiasm and Elon Musk is in his corner and they have all these powerful tools. And I think it's a bit misleading. I think like it's not connected to the reality of what's actually happening on the ground, which is that, every race since 2016, Donald Trump has lost. And since Roe fell, enthusiasm among Democrats has been at basically the highest level it's ever been. And so that's sort of the second part of this, is like, we're all still working off this 2016 platform and framework, when really we should be talking about 2020 and 2022 and 2023 special elections, which to me all are really positive signals for Democrats. And I think, if there's going to be a polling error and underestimating certain voter enthusiasm or whatever it is, there's just as good of a chance that it goes in the direction of Harris and Democrats as it does, Trump a la 2020 or 2016.
It's so hard to know, right? Because it's like, what are these pollsters doing, right? They claim that they have corrected, quote unquote, the errors in prior elections that underestimated Trump's strength, right? We don't know what any of that means. There's also credible accusations that there's this what's called poll herding, which means that all the pollsters are kind of cribbing off of each other's models. And so whatever mistake one direction or the other is going to be amplified in this election. There's also this whole debate that I have sidestepped fully about whether there's been a flood of Republican leaning polls. And the reason why I've sidestepped it is because there's plenty of like traditional media polls that say basically the same thing. So it's like I'm not that like what Rasmussen is saying and what the New York Times are saying is like well within the margins of errors in both. So I'm like, what are we spending our time on? But I agree. It's like, you look at what's going on right now. What are the main, what are the biggest megaphones out there, right? Where are we all communicating? We're communicating on X, owned by Elon Musk. And for sure, based on my experience, my feed is filled with stuff that I don't follow, that is not my politics, that seems to, to dovetail with his agenda. The biggest cable news company is Fox News. And then you look at what are the biggest podcasts out there. What's the big conversation this week? Who's going to go on Rogan, right? Like the biggest podcast in the world is somebody who certainly is right leaning. I know whatever he says, like he is, he's partial to RFK, was very friendly with Trump. My personal opinion is they would have been friendly towards Harris, not quite as, effusive, but it would have been an easy interview for her. But I guess like, on that front, Isaac, like I know I've seen you tweet about this, like what perhaps this idea that the base is really what matters at this point is explaining why, not just Trump did the MSG rally, as you're saying, but maybe why Harris doesn't want to spend time on Rogan, which I think is a mistake, but like maybe she's just saying, I need to just turn people out right now. That's my one goal.
Yeah, I think it's a mistake too, because to me, it's like her interview with Bret Baier on Fox News. There's no real downside. Most of the audience is already breaking in one direction. And the only opportunity you have is to make your case to like the 10 or 15 or 20% of people who are tuning in and are still really persuadable voters. That number is greater on Rogan than it is on Fox News, obviously. I mean, I'm a Joe Rogan listener. I like his show. I love the long form, the format of it. I think she could have gone on and really, showed a side of herself that maybe we're not seeing in some of these other interviews that would have been compelling to a lot of people who listen to that show. And if I was her campaign advisor, I would have had her on the first flight out.
Is it still possible she would? I was looking at her schedule and I'm like, if there was a day she would do it, it would probably be tomorrow. But
I mean, if she's
has anybody
smart,
reported that it's certain? Is a complete no? Like I was searching for it earlier.
According to Rogan, it's still on the table and they're still negotiating. And she's trying to set terms where he comes to her and it's only an hour and whatever else. But if I were her, I would totally go out there and be there on Sunday. But yeah, look, I think it's not like she's not doing these alternative media hits. She went on Call Her Daddy or whatever. Like she's going after. Yeah. She's going after women and people of color and the people that she knows represent her strongest chance to eat into Trump's margins and to kind of expand any lead she has. And for whatever it's worth, a lot of the polling indicates that it's working. I mean, the polls that I've seen from, everywhere from CNN to Morning Consult to Pew, they show that her numbers with Black voters, with Hispanic voters, with suburban women, with even white women who don't have college degrees, they're all improving, and they have been for the last couple of months. So if that's what she's trying to do, which I think is very obvious she's trying to do, I think she's doing a pretty good job of it. And, it might just be that in this race, both her and Trump are not really worried about the middle of the road voters. They're just worried about turnout among their base because they know how polarized the electorate is right now.
Well, it's interesting because one could read the tea leaves one way or the other when it comes to her. I don't think there's any question that Trump knows what his job is here. Like there's been very little messaging from him that seems in any way geared towards independence and undecided. Right. The question is for him is how does he go down that ladder that we just talked about and turn out these young men who are the least reliable voters out there. Now I was talking to Tom Bonnier from Target Smart earlier in the week, and the word is really untested. It's not that it's a wrong strategy, it's just untested. It might be the right strategy for him. I personally believe that if he, from that assassination attempt forward, the first one, just moderated his language and picked and choose his forums and just focused on the economy and had a more like inclusive message, he would be killing her right now. That's just my personal opinion because I do think he could have won over some independents. I think the ship has sailed on like the high propensity independents. Now the low propensity independents and undecideds, I think he could still win. The question is, are they going to turn out? It's untested, right? I don't want to say it's not going to happen. It's just untested, and it's a particularly low probability event when you don't have much of a ground game, right? Like when as it was reported, Elon Musk is busing people to Michigan who are not exactly clear on what they're doing and have these hard targets and are not like actual true believers in the campaign. And it's that plus it's also Charlie Kirk, right? Who is it on the other side of this turnout? Like you don't really have a robust data and turnout operation on the ground, and you're trying to turn out low propensity voters. Oof, I don't know, man. Like that's tough.
Yeah, I think one of the maybe undertold stories of this election and something we'll look back on is Trump's just like total surrender to the idea that he can't get the kind of Nikki Haley moderate Republican voter. I mean, the idea that Nikki Haley has sat around for the last few months was she just said in an interview the other day, waiting for a call from Trump and has not done a single campaign event or been, I mean, it's mind boggling to me. After she dropped out of the race, we were still getting 15, 17, 20% of Republican voters in swing states casting ballots for her in the Republican primary for president. And she had dropped out. I mean, there's clearly this group of this band of kind of moderate Republicans, whether they're never Trump Republicans from the get-go or people who turned on him after January 6th or whatever, who I think were gettable voters. And she's just been totally uninvolved. And that band of Americans that I think is not insubstantial. I mean, we obsess over Arab American voters in Michigan. I mean, I'm sure there's just as many, moderate independent Republican Haley voters in Michigan as there are Arab American voters. And we just don't talk about it. We've kind of just forgotten about them. And I think they could play a really big
Harris
role
hasn't
in the election.
forgotten about them. There was a week
Sure,
ago.
yeah.
The week ago, people were like criticizing our campaign for these Liz Cheney events. And I was looking at it. I'm like, I've heard Pluff talk about this publicly before. Their data is telling us that those are the most important, still up for grabs voters, and they vote. Like that's the thing. And they're a net +2. Because if those are truly people who are deciding between Trump and Harris, every one of those people you convince to vote for you is a +2, whereas every one of these young men, for instance, that Trump's trying to pull off of the couch is just a +1 because they weren't going to vote for Harris anyway, right? So, and look, you need all of these, but it's just a question of where are your resources best spent and your time and the words that come out of your candidate's mouth, which is the most limited resource you have. The Harris campaign, through this entire thing, has been signaling that they still want to go after those voters. Like even if you look at the Capitol speech that she gave in front of the White House, she had all these lines about how I'm going to invite in the people who disagree with me, and if you don't vote for me, you have a seat at the table. Obviously, it's made it a little bit harder with what do we want to call it? Garbage gate, apostrophe gate, or whatever, which we should talk about in a second. But I like in the end, like this has been her message from the get-go. Like, and she continues to hammer it home.
I will say I mostly agree that I think it's a smart campaign strategy to go after those voters. I do think specific to Michigan, I'm unclear exactly what Harris and the campaign think they're doing. I mean, to me, trotting out Liz Cheney and Bill Clinton, who's, lecturing Arab American and Palestinian American voters about how they should feel about all the death in Gaza, is not particularly smart. I mean, she could stop the bleeding on that, the uncommitted vote that appears at least to be committed to not casting ballots for her on election day. Trump's touring the state talking about how he's pro-Muslim, getting a Muslim mayor to endorse him, how he's going to end the war the moment he's in office. They're leaking stuff to the Times of Israel about how he's told Benjamin Netanyahu that, he needs to wrap it up before election day. I mean, that's a much better strategy than what Harris is doing to get that kind of up for grabs Arab American vote, maybe. So I think if I was going to criticize something, it would be that, like Liz Cheney, just a meme of a warmonger, basically, and then Bill Clinton always going off script.
Exclusive strategies. I think what they've decided is they have a more predictable path to those Haley voters than they do changing people's minds in the Arab American communities. And, they have put stuff out, like Bernie put out a long video that seems to be getting some traction. And you have a lot of those sort of validators who are like of the left, plus like other Arab American voices. But I think my sense of their calculation on that is that largely the reaction to Harris, Biden versus Trump, and these are not my words, but this is how they feel, is that it's largely an emotional reaction at the polls because it's out of frustration, not a validation of anything Trump is doing. I mean, the guy had Giuliani at his rally at Madison Square Garden on Sunday calling Palestinians terrorists or something like that, right? So it's like this is the guy who had the Muslim ban. So I think part of what they're trying to do is like micro target those communities and hope for the best, while at the same time like macro target the Haley voters who seem to be more widespread, and whereas I think like the Arab American vote is more potent in Michigan than anywhere else. It does give me as somebody who wants Harris to win, it does give me the chills a little bit because it is a risky scenario. I don't know what they would do though, honestly. Like I don't know what message they could send to the Arab American populations to change that emotional reaction, right? Like, because I think that there's the policies, right? What little separates Harris and Biden. And then there's the people who are pissed off about what she's done and what Biden have done now, which is the emotional content of it, where they're like, I don't care what Trump is saying he's going to do. I want to send a signal. Yeah.
I think the messaging, if I were her, for whatever it's worth, is not just that Trump will have your interests less in mind than I will if he gets elected. I mean, Trump is, quote unquote, as he says, the most pro-Israel president of all time. So if you're worried about, giving space and leeway to Netanyahu and the Israeli war cabinet to do whatever they want to do in Gaza and Lebanon, then a Trump presidency is a disaster. It should be. But I think like, even if your position, if I'm Harris, I'm saying, even if your position is that you really don't think that I'm any better than Donald Trump on this issue, then, not casting a ballot for me is sort of leaving like your LGBTQ friends in the lurch. It's leaving women's rights to get an abortion in the lurch.
Bernie's video essentially said yesterday. That's essentially what he was saying, and what AOC has been saying as well.
And I think that's a good argument. I mean, I see it. I follow a lot of the kind of pro-Palestine and pro-Israel accounts on social media and stuff, and I'm seeing that as like they're posting things about not voting for Harris, and the top responses are people saying like, hey, I've like supported this account. I'm a trans woman. And I feel like you're just abandoning me on like, even though I've backed you on this issue, whatever. And, it's the classic progressive infighting that you expect with issues like this. But I think it is a good, politically, it's a good, powerful message that they can send that maybe get some people to turn out and vote.
Yeah. I mean, we'll see. I mean, this could be the difference maker in Michigan. Obviously, a countervailing force, we talk about MSG, is what's been going on in the Hispanic communities since Sunday. And I don't have a good read. Like, obviously, you live in Pennsylvania, where the numbers people are quoting are 400 plus Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania, never mind some of the other states where you have 100 plus thousand Puerto Ricans in most of the other swing states. That rally seems to have done some significant damage to any traction Trump had within those communities. That's my first observation. My second question I have, which is, you have a lot of these people like Bad Bunny Jennifer Lopez, Mark Antony. And then you had, Tony Hinchcliffe's comments that were more generalizable, right? Like the whole not pulling out joke that he made. Is there any sense that this is a conversation outside of the Puerto Rican community as well, and where there's damage there for Trump, or whether it's contained just to that community?
I mean, look, I think either way, it's not good for the campaign. I mean, we sort of talked about this a little bit offline, like ignore the punditry on X and just pay attention to what campaign officials are doing and saying, because that's the clearest look into where their priorities are and what they're thinking about. The Trump campaign was in cleanup mode after this. I mean, they distanced themselves from the comedian. Trump did an interview on Fox News and said he shouldn't have even been there. They immediately went to Allentown, which has a massive Puerto Rican population, one of the biggest in PA, and held a rally. They're doing all this stuff to sort of stem the issue. And to me, that's just like, okay, both sides clearly understand this is something that's, palpable and has activated some people on the ground. I'd be surprised if the people who are most likely to care about a comment like this or a joke like this or be offended by it are, progressive white liberals, in my view. And so are any of them, moved or changed in their vote? I don't think so. Are they maybe more motivated to like do a final week of volunteering and get out the vote operations and sign up for stuff and, share that article with all their friends and tell them they have to vote to stop this racist monster? Yeah, I think so. So, it depends how you value those different kinds of quote unquote motivations, or whether it's, turning out a new voter or that voter turning out other people. I personally am shocked. I mean, I think it is like the irony of all ironies that an insult comic who is known for roasting literally every race and person and gender and religion under the sun somehow broke through in this election cycle with a joke about Puerto Ricans that, like, for whatever it's worth, knowing Tony Hinchcliffe's comedy is like not even remotely close to the most offensive stuff he says and the lines he crossed. I mean, that was like pretty tame for him. So it's kind of mind boggling to me that this is the thing that has like penetrated and been in a few days of a news cycle. And, that it wasn't something Trump said. It wasn't something Biden or Harris said. It wasn't Harris being called the Antichrist or, a terrorist sympathizer or any of these other like way over the top things. It was a joke about Puerto Rico. So that shocks me.
In the same rally, correct me if I'm wrong, and excuse me, audience, if I'm mixing this up, but didn't Trump call the country a garbage can, like the U.S.? And it's like, I'm sorry if I'm mixing this up. It's like hard to keep track here.
I don't think it was the same rally, but it was a similar kind of rally just a few weeks ago, actually.
Which is funny to me because that would presumably be more politically damaging. Like if you imagine, like, remember when Michelle Obama got in trouble for like, that was first time I was proud type of comment. I'm like, could you imagine if like Michelle Obama was like, this country is a trash can? It's like, what? Now, this gets to a couple of layers of analysis on what's going on here. And I've kind of shifted my thinking over the past few days slightly in terms of valence, which is I got on this podcast and I was basically just like, this is bullshit. I was like half like, I don't really like to say I get offended because it takes a lot to truly offend me, but it was just more like, I was more offended politically, just like what a dumb thing to do. And it's like, part of me is like, this guy has a 50-50 chance of being the next president of the United States, Trump. And if he's this reckless and incompetent about, this race that's going to keep him out of jail, what the heck kind of president is he going to be? Like, if this is like the execution, that's kind of what was going through my head. But then I started to think about like what's happening in the zeitgeist. And I think if you take the Hinchcliffe comments, which again, like it is a joke, it should have been predictable, yada, yada, yada. But at the same time, it's not just a regular stand-up set. He's endorsing somebody. So it's like, he's not exactly like off the hook here. And you have to be funny, right? Like you have to, that's part of it.
It wasn't a very funny joke. No, that was probably the most damaging part of it.
The Diddy joke I thought was funny. But then you have that going on, right? Like who's offended, who's not, who's pretending to be offended. And I reflect and I'm like, when am I actually offended? I should be clear about when I'm actually offended or not, because it's like a game that everybody's playing. Two is this Biden comment, right, where he basically said, and I don't know exactly what apostrophe gate means. I just see people making comments, but Biden stepped in and basically said Trump supporters are garbage or something like that, and everybody's debating what that means and all that. And then Vivek Ramaswamy and Trump are doing events with garbage trucks and all this, and everybody's being offended. And I'm like, this is political flopping, right? Like the equivalent, and I'm not the first person to use this term, but it's like the soccer games you watch and everybody's falling on the floor saying they're injured. I'm like, how many people, and I mean this broadly, I'm not picking on any particular party, how many people are actually offended by most of the things saying, and how many people are trying to amplify what's going on to seem offended so that they can get juice their turnout in this election? That's the big question I have today.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a great expression. I think Republicans are inherently better at politically flopping because they are less likely to be offended by things they shouldn't be offended by, just in our current political dynamics.
Say historically, I would agree with you. Lately, I'm a little. I would say
that it is getting a bit egregious, like the sensitivity of the. I mean, and it's especially egregious because, like you said, it's just like Trump is the face of the party. I mean, the guy. He has called Democrats pedophiles, evil, insinuated that they're like locking children in sex rings in the basement. I mean, the stuff that he says is so over the top. It's so much more egregiously like broad brush offensive.
And he attacks actions to it. This is the thing. It's like, it's one thing if it's like a comment. He's like, he's commingling the enemy within with Schiff and Pelosi, and at various points implying that he's going to use the military to go after some version of that category, which has obviously been a big debate about what he actually means. My general feeling is when you do that, it's on you to actually clarify what you mean. Like, it's not on me to try to figure out what you mean. Like, But yeah, what you say about people being offended, I think used to be true that the Republicans were better at this. I have major questions about whether they might be the worst at this point, like in terms of grievance hunting at this point. But that's
fair. I mean, it truly is like the victim, offensive Olympics, and it's campaign season. So I understand why it's happening, but man, it's exhausting to try and keep up. That's for sure.
Yeah. So, okay, let's bring it back to the substance here. So we've gone through and talked about this enthusiasm difference. One other thing that's interesting about this Nate Cohn data is that so much of this debate about whether Trump is making inroads with communities of color with Harris has to do with what segment of the electorate we're talking about. And if you look at the sort of breakdown that he gives here, and he's talking about 2022, right? If you look at vote history, who voted in 2022 versus didn't vote, right? Black voters. If it's people who voted in 2022, Trump's getting 9% of the black vote. If it's didn't vote in 2022, it's 16%, right? And that's true of all these categories, basically. You go down the list, and it's like, well, what kind of election are we in? Are we in a higher turnout or lower turnout election? And that's going to largely dictate whether Trump is successful here or not. Let's keep going on this. We've talked about the political flopping piece. This gets to the question of like, what are the campaign closing messages? You live in Philly. Honestly, I think one of the best ways you can tell what the closing messages are is to watch NFL football. Like, I was actually really, I have like whatever that program is that you could watch all the different cities and stuff. And I was like just watching the ads. And in some cases, some of the ads work really well without audio. So if you have like the 4 screen up, like especially Trump's ads, I would say are really good with just here's data, here's big text on front of it. Like, what's your sense as a Philly guy? What messages are penetrating outside of the zeitgeist and the bubble that you described?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, it's always hard to say what messages are penetrating. I can definitely tell you what messages I think the campaigns think are penetrating. I mean, interestingly enough, because it hasn't really been debated that much that I've seen in sort of the mainstream press, but Trump and the campaign are actually hammering the trans issue in a lot of it is like Harris wants to use your tax dollars to pay for inmates to
that
get
one
gender
Charlemagne
sex
ad.
changes.
I've seen it 50 times, and I'm not even in a swing state. Yeah.
And so I think they sense there's a real salience there. And in a lot of the House and Senate races, we're seeing that pop up too. A lot of advertising about Democrats who support, men and women's sports. And that framing, I think, is being deployed in a lot of ads. I will say I'm very, very skeptical that that's a good, closing message for them or an effective one. I think we've seen some politicians in 2022 and just in the Republican primary with Ron DeSantis who tried to make trans issues a core piece of their election strategy. And I think it just matters less to people than immigration and crime and the economy and all the sort of traditional, and obviously abortion, the traditional issues that we see. So that's one. And then of course, Trump is definitely hammering the crime stuff. And it's pretty easy for the campaign to tie crime and immigration together. There's been a lot of ads that I've seen and a lot of the talk that he's had, at the MSG rally that are basically just saying, Harris opened the door to all these illegal immigrants and here's what they've done when they've gotten here. And then the various, stories that have really had some salience about these brutal crimes that illegal immigrants have committed while inside the United States. I think that's a pretty effective, fear is one of the great motivators in politics. And I think that's pretty effective messaging. And they've got the clips of Harris saying she doesn't want to criminalize the border. She's went soft on a lot of these immigration issues in 2020 when she thought it was advantageous for her political career. All that stuff's coming back to bite her now. And then Harris is doing two things. First of all, I think she's running a lot of ads about abortion, which is smart. It's a lot of stuff about freedom and women's freedom and the freedom to choose. And this idea that, women need to make up their own minds separate from their spouses or their brothers or whatever. Like there are very targeted ads towards women. You're maybe not seeing them so much on, NFL Sunday, but I'm definitely seeing them on Pennsylvania cable TV. And then it's just like highlights of the Trump greatest hits where he's saying really over the top crazy things, stuff around January 6th, promising to get payback on all these people with sort of the closing message that like she's got this to-do list and Trump has the enemies list.
I've
and
heard that line so many times.
It's become a huge line.
Yeah, not a bad line. I'm left wondering. I'm trying to separate out these messages from what I view the reality of this country to be, right? Which is on the Trump side of things, could be effective. I agree with you. I have major questions, but what their strategy is try to take one issue, even if like how many trans operations in prison were there. I can't imagine that many people really care one way or another. People are literally getting raped every day in a lot of prisons across this country because we can't keep people safe, which is an issue I've talked about on this podcast many times. Like, I can't imagine this is the thing in and of itself that people are going to care about. But obviously it's a window into like this person, Harris, that is undefined. And so it tells you something about her and what she cares about if they highlight this issue, right? That's what they're trying to do. I agree with you that I'm not sure. Sometimes I think these campaigns, and I think both campaigns are guilty of this, they micro target to the point where the story gets muddled. Like they're like, oh, the data's telling me it moves people. But then when you put it in macro context, you're missing a larger story about what this race is about, right? And I think both campaigns have been guilty of this. When I think of the Harris side of things and what they're doing on abortion, and this is true of the rallies too, Michelle Obama, Harris, people are getting up and they're saying, look, men, first of all, they're using the abortion message to juice turnout with women. Smart, makes a lot of sense. And then they're saying, from the male side of things, they're saying, this is kind of your way to have the back of the women in your life. Like, I forget the exact language, but Michelle was talking about this too. And maybe that works, maybe it doesn't. But one thing I'm worried about long-term beyond this election is that these young men who may or may not turn out in this election are going to be older. They're going to start turning out more. There also is a crisis of young men in this country when, we've done episodes on this. We'll do more on it about college going rates, suicide rates. You go down the list. And there are real solutions that need to be debated to those problems. And it's not like Harris is totally blind to these things, and Richard Reeves, his thesis is that actually on a policy level, Democrats are better than Republicans, although Republicans are on an emotional level have been more validating on this. But most importantly, like that's not a long-term solution to this gender gap. Like you really need to have a story for young men beyond just have the backs of the women in your life. And I worry long-term about what this means for the party, that they're just really not telling a story that I find like is going to be that compelling to those young men who will start to turn out more and more on future elections. I'll get off my soapbox, but that's something that worries me here.
No, I think it's a good worry. I mean, I don't know if you heard it. I'm sure you did, but the New York Times just did a great podcast about the gender gap, and they interviewed a bunch of women who are voting for Kamala Harris and a bunch of men who are voting for Donald Trump, young women and young men. And the way the young men talk about it, they have so much clarity about what's motivating them. And it's that like this one party, being the Democratic Party, is just constantly telling them about all the things that are wrong about them and all the horrible ways that they're impacting the world and just like how corrosive their very existence is. And that's what they get from a lot of progressive messaging. And then there's another party that's promising opportunity and like a wife and a family and a job and, you know, the ability to support the people in your life and all these things that are like so, you know, intrinsically, stereotypically male and are is always something that like young men often strive for or want. And these kids who like lack some sense of purpose, who maybe are unemployed or didn't go to college or they're addicted to video games or porn or whatever it is, they see this candidate saying that like he's going to deliver this future for them that includes all these things they want. And it's really simple, you know, and I totally agree. I don't think Democrats are offering that messaging. I don't think they have a good counter message for it. And I think
that's why they're not going on Rogan. It's like, I think such a mistake.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I totally agree.
Well, and it's also, if Harris wins this election, it'll be because of the Democrats' ability to moderate as they get closer to elections. Better probably than Republicans tend to. If they lose this election, it'll be because they racked up this bill, this psychic bill over the past 6 years for things like abolish ICE, defund the police, believe women, right? You think about the male message, right? Around something like believe women, something we talked about on this podcast before, which is like, women are 50% of the population. Marjorie Taylor Greene is a woman. When she says they're Jewish space lasers, I don't believe her. Like it just, it's just like, that's a sloppy slogan. And anytime I heard Rahm Emanuel talk about this in the context of defund the police, where he was saying, look, every time somebody tries to defund the police, they're like, that's not actually what it means. And then he's like, well, then don't use the effing slogan, right? If like what the literal words aren't what you mean, then don't use it, right? And I think when it came to some of these slogans around gender, at the sort of height of a lot of really important moments that had a lot of good to them, like Me Too, there was a little bit of bullying going on and sloppy sloganeering and identity politics that was, I think a lot of men look around and are like, well, like that seems like a little incomplete, right? Is that I'm just the enemy and people shouldn't believe anything I have to say no matter what. There's been a lot of cleanup happening for Democrats. If they win, it's because they did it pretty aggressively. Like they tacked moderate and tried to jettison these ideas rather aggressively. If they lose, it's because they spent a lot of time saying a lot of things that I think were unpopular with the American public, you know?
Yeah. I mean, the postmortem on this is going to be a pretty wild and deep one, I think, regardless of which way it goes. I definitely think, you know, if Democrats lose, the fractures within the party are going to come to the surface in a really, really big way because there's so much disagreement about how Harris has run this campaign and whether she was even a better candidate than Biden and all this stuff. And yeah, it'll be pretty wild.
Let me be on record to say, no matter what happens in this election, anybody who comes out of the woodwork to say Biden would have done better is insane. Like, I think this week was a clear example of that. Like, what was the worst thing that happened to Harris's campaign this week? Something Joe Biden said. What's the major question that voters still have about Harris? It's like, how will you be different than Biden? Right? Like, there's a simplistic argument that people will make, which is win, lose. If she loses, it should have been Biden. I'm like, Biden was guaranteed to lose. whatever she does, the fact that this is even a conversation is we're only having a conversation because Biden dropped out. Like if Biden were
Yeah.
still in this race, we would be planning for whatever the Trump presidency is. Like already, like we would, it's like it's crazy. Okay, well, before I let you go, you've been sharing a pretty consistent update on just stuff happening at the polls. There was a good Wall Street Journal article today about preemptive efforts from the Trump team to sow doubt on the results in Pennsylvania. What's happening out there? I'm reading reports of machete wielding at the polls, or a guy gets arrested, and I saw JD Vance celebrating a woman who ripped her shirt off and insulted poll workers. Like, are we just in for one of the ugliest days in American history on Tuesday?
I'm not encouraged. I'll tell you that much. I mean, for anybody who's been following my work for any appreciable amount of time, one of the things that I was most well known for and am most well known for was that in 2020, I tracked a lot of these election fraud claims with a very open mind and tried to deconstruct them and figure out what was going on, and often ended up debunking them because most of them are total bullshit. And the flood of election fraud claims is already here, and we haven't even hit the polls yet. And they are as nonsensical and in many cases absurd as they were in 2020, but they're penetrating in a different way, I think, because of what's happening on X as a platform and other social media platforms that have backed off, moderating things that are tied to politics. So, first of all, I'll say election fraud and voter fraud happens in every election. So I'm always open-minded about this stuff. In fact, we've had a couple instances already that were totally legit. I mean, in Bucks County, where I'm from, there was a big hubbub about people not being let in, before 5. They showed up before 5 o'clock when the polls were supposed to close, and there was a long line, and they were turned away at the door. And, people were calling it voter suppression and all this stuff, which is ridiculous because Bucks County is a purple county, but neither side wants to be clear.
They were calling it conservative voter suppression because they were implying that Bucks County is a conservative area. And as you and many people pointed out, it's actually gone for Democrats in the past few major national elections.
Yeah, in the last 4 elections. But then, it turned out that the grievances that people had were actually legit. I mean, they were turning away people too soon. The county officials said that they had some miscommunication about the lines and who they could let in and when. And then a judge in Bucks County extended early voting for an extra day or two, which is great. There was a lawyer in Michigan, who claimed that he found multiple people voting from one address in the QVC file, this voter file that exists in Michigan. And then it turned out that it was a glitch. Lara Trump, the Trump campaign came out, they investigated it. It wasn't actual voter fraud. But, the tweet went viral before the Secretary of State or anybody could respond. And so he had found this weird anomaly, and now a bunch of people believe hundreds of thousands of people voted illegally in Michigan, which didn't happen. And then there's like total nonsense ones, people finding monasteries where a bunch of nuns live and claiming that, hundreds of people are voting from this one address when like actually 100 people do really live there and they're nuns, and you just accuse them all of voter fraud and posted all their names on the internet. Like it's total madness. So, just please double check stuff before you share it. Try Googling things, just like look up legit news stories about them. Check the comments for people fact checking them. Go follow my Twitter, follow my thread. I'm doing my best to keep it updated, and people can send me stuff they see out in the wild and I'll look into it. And, some of the stuff like the Bucks County thing and the Michigan data set, when I saw those, I said, this could be something legit. I can't totally explain what's happening here. And then we got an explanation. Some of the stuff is just like recycled nonsense from 2020. They're old videos, old posts, whatever, being reused now. But yeah, there's a lot of doubt being sowed, and I'm not enthusiastic about how election day is going to go.
When you have a federalist system in which states and localities run their elections, we are going to have incompetence, right? So that's the number one thing. But in this case, anytime there's an incompetence or just inconvenience, people are going to attach conspiracy to it. This is the sister of political flopping that we talked about. And 2 is there's real intimidation happening out there. I talked about it, I think earlier this week. I did a video on it. Like there's a lot of like truly egregious behavior happening out there. And that's unfortunate. And those people need to be prosecuted. And the third part is almost never has this risen to the level of anything material in an election before. Like, one person, voting at the wrong address or whatever, which is bipartisan, or like in a state they no longer live in and sending in a ballot, all that kind of stuff is one off here, one off there. People need to pay attention to that stuff, but never is it material in an election. Have I ever heard? But people love to talk about it. It's just like it's a hot topic. But
yeah, and not for nothing. Look, I hate to obsess over the guy or spend all this time talking about him, but Elon Musk is making this stuff notably worse. I mean, I was somebody who celebrated his purchase of Twitter because I actually thought that he was going to shepherd in a different era of social media, censorship and balance. He is very clearly thumbing the scales, and he's amplifying just nonstop nonsense that's easily explainable by people like me who understand how a lot of this stuff works. And it's really scary. I mean, the pieces of content have millions and millions of views, and people already believe that if Harris wins, there's no way she did it legally. And we are 5 days out from the election. I mean, that's not good. That is a really bad place to be. So I'm a bit overwhelmed and concerned about it, but all we can do is kind of flood the zone with better information best we can. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do.
Right. And, final point on this is when Arnold Schwarzenegger endorsed Kamala Harris yesterday, he mentioned January 6th. And I think the reason why he and even I and a lot of people continue to want to talk about it is because January 6th has been every day since January 6th, because this stuff keeps going on, right? Like there continues to be both a narrative about what happened before, but more importantly, how to view this election coming up with real actions attached to it, not just offending people, but literally trying to change the very nature and confidence that we have in our elections with no evidence whatsoever. And often in cases like spreading straight up lies. And it's really sad, but you've been great with your time. We probably will not talk before the election. So good luck in the final stretch. For everybody out there, get out there, subscribe to Read Tangle. Check out their podcast, their YouTube page. We'll link to all of those in the show notes. You can leave voicemails 321-200-0570. Remember to send in a rating, give us 5 stars, say what you love about the podcast. We will be back maybe before the election, who knows? But stay safe out there, get out there and vote.